Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I want to start by thanking the event organizers, Offshore Wind California, and today's webinar sponsors, Mainstream Renewable Power, Equinor, and Acre Offshore Wind. As a sign of the growing interest in the California offshore wind market, more than 500 people have registered for this event, and they're tuning in from locations in California and throughout North America and Europe. We're grateful that you've joined us and look forward to a great discussion today. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Offshore Wind California website within a few days. We have disabled the chat for general use, but you can use the chat button if you have any technical issues to reach our technical producer, Hunter Rich. And to ask questions of our speakers, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll leave some time at the end of the panel for Q&A. So with that, let's turn to the topic that we'll be discussing today, permitting offshore wind in California. While we've been planning this panel for a few weeks now, we could not have picked a more appropriate time to have this conversation. As I'm sure many of you know, just yesterday, the Biden administration and Governor Newsom announced a plan for the first areas for commercial scale offshore wind off Northern and Central California. And for those of us who've been involved in the US offshore wind market for some time, this is a very exciting moment in the industry, both in California and nationwide. Just earlier this month, the US approved the first commercial scale project off the East Coast, the Vineyard Wind Project, and there are 15 additional construction and operation plans pending with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that are currently being processed for additional projects off the East Coast. BOEM is also in the process of identifying several new offshore wind lease areas off the East Coast and now offshore California. And this is all as part of this unprecedented momentum that we're seeing at the federal level to continue this progress, driven by the Biden-Harris administration's goal to reach 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. At the state level, just in the past couple of years, states have set ambitious renewable energy targets and procurement goals aiming at attracting offshore wind development off their coasts. So tremendous amount of energy and excitement and developments both at the state and federal level. And while all the leasing and permitting activity to date has been focused on the East Coast, offshore wind is now moving closer to being a reality off the coast of California. The permitting process for offshore wind, which is the topic that we'll talk about today, is a critical piece of achieving that reality. And today we have an outstanding panel of experts who will discuss both the state and federal processes that will guide the development of offshore wind in California, including lessons that each of them have learned and can be applied from the East Coast. So I want to take a moment to briefly introduce each of our panelists. Lisa Gilbane is the chief of the environmental analysis section of BOEM's Pacific office, and in that role, she's playing a critical part in defining the first set of leases and lease areas offshore California. Jennifer Maddox serves as a science policy advisor and tribal liaison at the California State's Lands Commission, where she supports the Commission's renewable energy, climate change adaptation, and coastal resource management efforts. And as a tribal liaison, she conducts government-to-government consultation with California Native American tribes and works to uplift Indigenous perspectives in the Commission's decision-making. Whitney Fiore is a senior manager for NEPA and natural resources at SWCA. She has led the permitting of several of the first offshore wind projects and wind lease energy areas in the US, and brings a tremendous amount of experience to this conversation. And last but not least, Craig Reiser is a marine biologist and regulatory advisor with Smaltea Sciences, where his primary focus is on protected species monitoring and mitigation in support of US Atlantic offshore wind development. Previously, Craig was involved in numerous offshore energy monitoring programs in Pacific and Arctic oceans and operated under the US Marine Mammal Protection Act permitting frameworks. We're grateful to each of you for your perspectives today. And Lisa, I want to start with you. Obviously, a big day for your agency and the entire industry yesterday. BOEM is the lead government regulator for offshore wind in the US and will be driving the process offshore California. Can you talk us through BOEM's role in authorizing offshore wind development and what we should expect next in California?
Yeah, thank you, Rhea, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm glad I get to speak on this point. As Rhea mentioned, I'm Lisa Gilbane. I'm the Pacific Environmental Analysis Section Chief in the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, so that's BOEM. We're in the Department of Interior. And I just want to briefly start with BOEM's role in supporting the Biden-Harris administration's agenda on the nation's transition to a cleaner energy future. So the president stated that when he thinks of climate, he thinks of people and he thinks of jobs. So offshore wind will provide tremendous potential to address these threats of climate change and also provide those jobs. And yesterday, Secretary Haaland reiterated that the Department of Interior is committed to responsibly growing the offshore wind industry. And that's to reap the benefits of this clean energy and the job creation, particularly in disadvantaged communities. So, but before I dive into California, I do think because we're focusing on environmental permitting, we want to start with just a 2-minute primer on the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's process. And so overall, this offshore wind process is a multi-step phased approach, and it takes years before we get approval and before we get steel in the water. So a key part of that multi-process step are the environmental reviews. And so that's the environmental assessments, the environmental impact statements, and the purpose of those are required under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And the purpose of NEPA is to disclose the potential environmental impacts to the public prior to a federal action. So getting back to BOEM's process, there's 2 points where we have environmental reviews, and those are conducted prior to BOEM making the decision point for BOEM. You can think of it as a 2-step, right? So the first step, and that's the step we're really going to talk about today, is the environmental review that concerns the wind energy areas. So wind energy areas are those areas that are most suitable to continue in the process of evaluating potential offshore wind leasing. So you may have heard of the call areas, which are call for information and nominations. There's 3 of them offshore California. And now we're kind of moving into this discussion of wind energy areas, which are defined areas within the calls. And so the first review, this review is typically an environmental assessment, and the purpose is to create the potential impacts that are reasonably foreseeable as a result of leasing. And to date, those have been site characterization activities and site assessment activities. And so importantly, a lease does not authorize construction. It informs the decision of issuing leases. And later, once we have data about the wind resource, about the biology, the setting, and the seafloor, then BOEM does conduct a project-specific review, and that is an approval or review of the construction and operation plan. So, Rhea, did you want me to talk more about California specifically?
Yes, so thanks, Lisa.
Sure.
Great overview. Can you, obviously we saw the big announcement yesterday. Can you talk us through the work that's been done in California to date and what we can expect in terms of next steps?
Yeah, sure. I think that's why some people are here today to talk more specifically about California. So I just want to be clear again that renewable energy development on the Pacific coast is at an earlier stage than the Atlantic. So we all understand that there's currently no leases issued for offshore wind on the Pacific coast. But yesterday, hopefully some of you heard that the Departments of Interior and Defense with the state of California committed to advancing offshore wind in both the central and the northern parts offshore California. And that is to support a 4.6 gigawatt capacity and enough to power at least 1.6 million homes. And so there was 2 parts to that announcement. The first one focused on Central California, where those departments have identified an area that can move forward. And that's a 3 gigawatt capacity area estimated at 399 square miles offshore, kind of northwest of Morro Bay. And you may have heard of it as the Morro Bay 399 area. And then the second part of that announcement was to advance the Humboldt Call area. So that's a 206 square mile area offshore Humboldt County. And the capacity estimated for that is 1.6 gigawatts. So, moving forward, we need to first talk about our commitment to consultation and engaging the tribal governments. And so those that have known or potential interest in wind energy planning offshore California. And our goal is to do this in a manner that's respectful of the tribal sovereignty, the government to government relationship between the tribal governments, the US federal government, and the tribes and policies, the practices of each tribe, and to the extent we can. And so we've invited government to government consultations with these federally recognized tribes on the Morro Bay Call area extensions, and we'll continue to work with consulting as the lease process continues, both in the North and the Central Coast. And our next step in California is to hold an intergovernmental renewable energy task force, or the task force. And so there's a meeting that's in partnership with state of California agencies. The Department of Defense is coming, and save the date for June 24th on that. So the focus of this meeting, we'll be looking at the areas both in the North and the Central Coast and discussing the potential wind energy area establishment. So in conclusion, I just want to say one more thing. I just want to be clear that, I think this is an efficient and expeditious schedule for offshore wind. But I need to be clear that we can't outpace our commitment to do this right. And so since we're focusing today on environmental permitting, I wanted to kind of highlight 3 points. The first is we have to follow the laws and regulations. So on that point, BOEM is going to follow our approach out here to the approach we've had in the Atlantic, because we have the same laws and the same regulations. But to say that, of course, California is unique, especially in some fundamental ways. So we're going to be talking about floating wind today, not monopiles and fixed bottom foundations. Secondly, we got to talk about science, because it's just pivotal to understanding the potential impacts for the natural resources and human environment. So our reviews will be transparent, and they have to rely on the best available data. And lastly, of course, we have engagement and public input, and that is an essential role. We've been asking for comments and inputs at BOEM since 2016 in California, and we will continue this critical component as we move through offshore wind. So we'll continue to listen to our partners, and we have to consider all the perspectives. So those are the perspectives of the tribes, the federal agencies, the fishing community, industry, labor unions, and to move forward in a safe and responsible manner. And so, while this multi-step, two-step process at BOEM can be confusing, I do believe it is consistent and helpful for the reason the National Environmental Policy Act exists, and that's to disclose and evaluate environmental impacts. So this approach, I really do think, will give industry, gives tribes, agency, and stakeholders multiple points to consider. First, the where of offshore wind. So where is offshore wind in California going to be? And then secondly, to think about the what is it going to look like? So those two things, the where and the what, they inform each other. But right now in California, I want everyone to keep in mind today that we're talking about the siting and the planning for offshore wind. So thanks for letting me say my piece, and I appreciate that question, Ryan.
Thanks so much, Lisa. That was a really helpful overview, and obviously a lot of important work ahead for BOEM. Whitney, I want to turn to you now. The Department of Defense was part of yesterday's announcement, and Lisa referenced the work that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has done with DoD and other federal agencies as part of the Intergovernmental Task Force. Can you describe what other federal agencies will have a role in authorizing offshore wind development in California?
Sure, Raya. Thank you. And thank you, Lisa. That really was a great overview. Hunter, if you don't mind putting up the slide number 2, that would be great. So although BOEM is the lead agency, has the jurisdiction over renewable energy in federal waters, there are a number of other federal agencies that have jurisdiction over resources that are contained in that area. So BOEM doesn't go it alone, shall we say. So they need to work very closely with their other federal partners, cooperating agencies that have consultation authority. And so just to name a few, the National Marine Fisheries Service and NOAA also for EFH consultations and Marine Mammal Protection Act consultations. They will have a lot of involvement. They are a key partner in getting through the NEPA process and getting, not for the COP itself, the construction and operation plan. So I'm trying not to use so many acronyms today. For the construction and operation plan and the permit that comes for the project itself, they have a lot of jurisdiction over what happens, how it's installed, how it's operated. They also have jurisdiction over some of the survey activities that are happening. So there's a process that a project proponent would have to consult with them through their activities with BOEM. There's also, you may need a take authorization from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There is a Section 106 consultation. I know Lisa talked about their tribal obligation. They also have an obligation under the National Historic Preservation Act for any archaeological or historic impacts, say to onshore structures from either cable landfall or onshore facilities or even visual impacts. So there's that the Section 106 consultation will occur with the State Historic Preservation Office, but it is a federal obligation. And so that will be part of the NEPA process. There's also, you have to get clearance with the Federal Aviation Administration. There's US Coast Guard authorizations because now you have, there are obstructions in possibly navigation. And so all of that has to be coordinated. So there are a lot of agencies that must be involved, including DOD, which a lot of that effort happens up front because, if DOD doesn't say yes, then it's very difficult to get past that but we are there now. So very excited about that.
Great, thanks so much, Whitney. And obviously a very complex and multi-actor field on the federal side. Jennifer, I want to turn to you now to talk about the state side of this. We've talked a lot about the federal government's role, but states also play a critical role in creating favorable conditions for offshore wind, and then in authorizing offshore wind development. Can you talk about the targets and recent legislation that are guiding renewable energy development in California?
Yes, thank you so much, Raya. As I look at it, we can really kind of trace back about 15 years with the enactment of California's landmark Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32 in 2006. This act required the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, which was last year. But we met those goals in 2016, 4 years early. And we saw that the need for additional action was very clear. So in the last 5 years, we've had a flurry of additional executive orders followed by complementary legislation. These include SB 32 in 2016, which codified Governor Brown's Executive Order B 3015. This demands that we lower our greenhouse gas emissions even further to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. That's just 9 years from now. In addition to those greenhouse gas reduction goals, the state has legislated renewable energy procurement targets via SB 350 in 2015 that required 50% renewables by 2030, and SB 100, that's kind of the hot one right now, which accelerated that to 50% by 2026 and 60% by 2030. Lastly, at least for today's purposes, the executive order, another Governor Brown executive order B 5518, established a goal that the state achieve carbon neutrality by at the latest 2045. And that's really ambitious. And as of now, the state is actually not on track to meet either the SB 100 2030 target or the B 5518 goal. So there's a lot of urgency to really redouble our efforts to put additional renewable and non-greenhouse gas producing energy sources into production. And that's why I say that sort of these factors, and combined with the federal announcements and momentum, really are creating a perfect situation for us to move offshore wind forward, not only for its ability to contribute to these goals, but also for the fact that it is a much more sort of 24-hour cycle reliable source and is a real complement to a lot of the solar that we have put in place now. So, it's a unique situation right now. Not only do we need to look at sort of the potential environmental impacts, which is where a lot of focus goes, but we need to also look at the overall benefits of this type of a project to help us stabilize the overall health of our ocean ecosystems and our climate here in California and around the world.
That's great. And you talked a lot about the state's targets, and that's obviously a very important part of creating the environment for this industry to flourish, the state also plays an important role in authorizing offshore wind development and related facilities. And I wanted to focus on your agency and its role in particular in that process. Can you tell us a little bit more about the California State Lands Commission and what role it plays in leasing offshore wind?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The State Lands Commission is sort of a sneaky little thing. We're a very small agency of less than 250 staff, but we actually have a very broad jurisdiction. We're a 3-member body. We were established in 1938, and we're comprised of 2 electeds and an appointed official. That's the Lieutenant Governor, the State Controller, and the Director of the Department of Finance. So our role is as the land and resource manager of the state's public trust lands, which are the tide, and it's not really time for that slide yet. We're the land and resource manager of the state's public trust lands. These are the tide and submerged lands all along the state's 1,100+ mile coast, as well as navigable rivers and lakes. What's really interesting about the State Lands Commission is that it is founded in the public trust doctrine. And that is a common law doctrine that includes as public trust consistent values, commerce, navigation, fishing, recreation, and open space. Any proposed use of these submerged lands must be brought to the commission for consideration of a lease. And the commission will determine if it is public trust consistent and if it is in the best interest of the state. These lands belong to all the people and we are just the steward. So for offshore wind, the state's role would be to consider a lease, either for portions, as we're talking about today, conduits coming through from federal waters to shore, or for the entire facility if that facility was proposed in state waters. So this puts us in the position of being, for California Environmental Quality Act compliance, the lead agency. So we would expect and hope that we would be continuing our close coordination with the federal government to jointly review and prepare documents for CEQA and NEPA compliance. And I'll just say a couple more things. So if you recall that I mentioned the 5 public trust categories, it's important to note that the public trust is not a static doctrine. It is ever evolving, sometimes via court decisions, and sometimes like now, due to changing public trust needs, like our very urgent need to stabilize climate and adapt. There's special challenges for the commission related to determining the proper public trust balancing among sometimes competing uses and values. For example, offshore wind is public trust consistent. It is water dependent commerce. It can also help us achieve our state's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and contribute to slowing climate effects and ocean degradation. But we also have to consider that developments such as offshore wind can have adverse effects on marine fish and wildlife resources, as well as to fishing and tribal interests. And so it's important that the commission get all the information that it needs to provide for that careful balancing. So California takes environmental protection very seriously, and there's a ton of agencies involved in the decision making. And this is where I would love to have that graphic up. We'll show you a visual of many of the agencies who may have permitting or regulatory jurisdiction over an offshore wind project. So when the commission prepares its CEQA document, it's really important that it is mindful of the needs and jurisdiction of all of these agencies who will need to rely on the commission prepared document for their own approvals. So I'll just highlight here, for example, our sort of overlapping and complementary aspects of our review with like the Coastal Commission, for example, or the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. But because we are not a statutorily constructed agency, rather a common law public trust derived agency, we have a unique nature. And so we're hoping to really help use that unique nature to contribute and be a responsible steward of the state's public trust assets.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that overview. So we've talked about the role of federal and state agencies in deciding where and how offshore wind projects should be installed. And one critical piece of the analysis for both federal and state government agencies relates to the marine environment and making sure that project siting, development, and related activities are done in a way that minimizes any impacts to marine species. That's a key part of the analysis that both federal and state agencies will have to undertake. And as part of that, access to good baseline data is critical. So Craig, I want to turn it over to you now. Can you discuss the state of available baseline data that can inform siting decisions off the coast of California?
Yes, thank you, Raya. It's great to be here. It's a great time to be discussing these things. And I think the topic of available baseline science is, as Lisa suggested in her opening comments, critical to this process is the need to collect, gather, and then analyze all of best available science to inform some of these siting decisions. So fortunately for us on the West Coast, we've been at these types of things for quite a while. The US Pacific Coast and California's offshore environments in particular have been studied in great detail for decades now. Historical interest in California's marine environments by groups such as the US Navy, oil and gas developers, federal, state, local, and regulatory bodies, academic institutions, and quite a few other groups have given rise to a significant number of environmental baseline studies that date back to the middle of last century, if not earlier. A good example would be the Office of Naval Research. Some of you may know them as ONR. Congress established ONR way back in 1946, and actually this was the nation's first permanent agency dedicated to funding civilian scientific research and technology development. ONR remains a noteworthy science engine to this day. I was just looking at their site last week for some things, and it's really impressive to look at the breadth and the scope of science that they're still involved in to this day. Similarly, and at about this same time, mid-last century, there was growing interest in carbon-based energy reserves off the California coast. This again led to countless baseline and long-term monitoring studies conducted by a wide range of public and private entities. Many of these studies paved the way for related efforts that continue to this day. So those are just a couple of examples of interests, historical interests that have led to this baseline, this massive body of science that we have now. So clearly, we've been at this for a while, investigating California's offshore environment. If we had time, I would like to talk much more about this cumulative body of science. It truly is impressive. I actually consider this California baseline and all of the science that we've gathered in the many decades about as comprehensive and complete as any other data set on the planet. Now, this is not to suggest that we know everything or do not have data gaps that merit additional investigations, such as perhaps sampling effort during winter months. The data we do have tend to skew a bit towards summer. But as a whole, the collective results from decades of study speak for themselves, and they have given us a strong overall understanding of the California offshore ecosystem, from the biological communities to the intricacies of its physical oceanography. So we have learned a great deal to work from and draw from now to permit offshore wind. One of the best ways to wrap our minds around just how much science has been conducted and is available now regarding California's marine environment is to explore the many online data repositories that have taken shape in recent years. So Hunter, if we could have that slide 4. So this is just a high-level sampling of a few of these portals that came to mind when I tried to think of some resources some of you may want to look into here. The California Offshore Wind Energy Gateway by data basin. This is a big one as an example of the types of data already out there, readily available. So if you go to this California Offshore Energy Gateway, I was curious to know just what kind of seabird colonies we have associated with the California coast. Where are they? What are they? And I did a simple query and it generated this map here that you see. There is literally every seabird colony known to exist in California. You can zoom in on this. You can get the details of these colonies, where the data came from. You can layer this with other things. You want to see, how fisheries resources, all of these things can be gathered at your fingertips. BOEM has an environmental and technical studies page for their Pacific region. There you'll see a pretty impressive body of current studies underway, many of those with Lisa's name after them. Tethys is another one. This was actually created by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory for the purpose of assessing impacts, potential impacts related to offshore energy development. So another great data portal and information exchange site. The last one I'll mention is Marine Cadastre. This has really grown in scope and scale over the years, and it's become a very valuable marine spatial planning tool through incorporation of all these data that they now house. So we have a lot of science, and that is in and itself significant. And I want to emphasize one more thing, and that's the fact that we already have it centralized, pulled together, and available in some of these online repositories. And again, this is noteworthy. All offshore wind stakeholders already have access to this information at their fingertips, including members of the public as well as regulatory agencies. So what this means in a permitting context is that much of the front end heavy lifting required for preparation of California's offshore wind environmental assessments, the environmental impact statements Lisa mentioned, the literature, a lot of the information gathering, this is heavy lifting. This has already been done to a large extent. We have this science already centralized and available. So this body of readily available science should position BOEM, California regulators, and others to hit the ground running, so to speak. This was not the case 10 or even 5 years ago on the East Coast. Thanks, Raya.
That's great. Thanks, Craig. And I'm glad that you ended with a reference to the East Coast. I know a number of you have spent decades working on projects off the East Coast, and there are obviously a number of key differences with development offshore California that we've already alluded to, technology, marine environment. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the parallels or lessons that can be taken from the experience on the East Coast. So Whitney, you've had a lot of experience with the first set of lease sales and projects that have gone through the permitting process off the East Coast. What are some of the lessons learned that offshore wind developers can bring to California and going through the permitting process there?
Well, interestingly enough, what Craig concluded on was the body of data that is available on the California coast compared to the East Coast when we started doing the environmental assessments for the lease areas offshore. There was not this body of data that was available. So one of the things that I know on the East Coast to this day is there still seems to be some concern on the part of stakeholders in some of the states where offshore wind is well on its way. There still seems to be concerns from mariners, from land people who live on shore, that maybe they're going to be impacted in ways that they haven't been told. And one of the things that could be done as far as the environmental assessments that will be done, or assessment that will be done, at least for Morro Bay and Humboldt, and maybe if there are future California wind energy areas that are analyzed, is maybe taking that robust available data and doing more, providing more information at this first step of the two-step process, the first step, providing more of that robust analysis so that folks know what is out there, so that it's not them going to the database, and for example, that it's in the document, even as an appendix, so that you can say, look, this is what we know about marine species in this area. This is what we know about artifacts and archaeology in this area to the extent we're allowed to disclose. This is what we know about navigation in this area. So giving that information up front might assuage some of the concerns of stakeholders far sooner than at the project level. Another thing that I think could maybe benefit the projects in California is the Section 106 consultation process for the East Coast has been quite prolonged and really does take a substantial amount of time. So the possibility of maybe starting that Section 106 consultation earlier in the process, rather than, after the notice of intent to prepare an EIS, when a project is, again, already they've completed their construction and operation plan, and they're way down the line. So maybe trying to get your ducks in a row for Section 106, get your consulting parties on board, doing something along those lines to bring them into the fold. And maybe, again, you're looking for buy-in. A lot of this, we could call it pre-scoping if you want. I mean, there's a lot of things, informal consultation, there's a lot of things we can call it, but maybe doing that earlier on. So commercial fisheries on the East Coast, have been challenging for a lot of the projects. I mean, you hear this from the regulatory agencies, you hear this from the developers. So one of the things that developers might consider doing, especially because in California, we have just California, it's not Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York. It's really just one state. And the possibility of developers early on maybe banding together and hiring a fisheries liaison so that they're also have a stake in this outreach, in this early on outreach, and talking about potential, agreements or mitigation efforts or avoidance areas, all of those things, doing that really early on. And the developers are all on the same page. I just came off a panel on the East Coast, and one of the topics we discussed was this sort of stakeholder involvement that's happening on the East Coast, where it's repetitive. They're doing it for Vineyard Wind 1, and now they're going to do it for Vineyard Wind 2. It's all the same people. For Revolution Wind, it's all the same people. So maybe trying to, do that more on a coordinated level across the lease areas that will end up being early on. And then I think lastly, we definitely saw this with the last administration and the current administration. There are always going to be changes. There are going to be regulatory changes. There's going to be guidance changes. There's going to be administration changes. And so one of the things that agencies need to do, and again, we just talked about this on my last panel as well, and people far smarter than me were saying this, what they need to figure out a way to do, and that what they're working toward doing, is being more nimble and being able to, even in light of those changes, keep on path, keep projects moving forward. Because, with this 30 by 30 goal, there's a lot of pressure to get these projects going. So I will conclude with, those are the lessons learned, or maybe ideas from the East Coast that we might incorporate and move in a little bit different direction here on the West Coast.
Very helpful. Thanks, Whitney. I want to talk now about some of the differences. Lisa, you mentioned the difference in technology that we will see between the East Coast and the West Coast, floating turbines on the West Coast instead of monopiles that we've had in the proposals on the East Coast. What are the, will that lead to any differences in the pre-construction surveys of the seafloor that will need to be conducted as part of project proposals?
Sure, Rhea, but I have to just say one thing that I've forgot to mention before regarding Section 106 consultation. And our archaeologist in our region in BOEM, he spent a year of his life trying to, with the state, working on a programmatic agreement. And so we have that in place in California. And the primary reason he spent that time was to, with an understanding that the program is complex and it may involve multiple undertakings. And it's hard, you can't complete an identification of historic properties prior to a lease issuance. And those kind of logistics make 106 confusing to me. And so this, I just want to say that we have a programmatic agreement, and we're hoping that this really helps set a standard process and a path moving forward that will help with some of the things Whitney mentioned. So I had to say that, but back to your actual question is, clearly having anchors and not monopiles is a difference. And that's going to cause a lot of corresponding differences down the supply chain and such. But I just want to say, I think for the most part, especially industry, they should expect a kind of similar level of surveys. And so what I mean by that is, we have these guidelines that we publish, and that is kind of what we expect. And I would expect similar things for anchors. And so I know I would expect that we would have borings at the anchor spots and a similar geophysical survey approach, and maybe even a larger survey area that's required as a part, instead of having one monopile, you have multiple anchoring, and maybe it's that you have a larger survey area. So I need people to hear that early, because I do know how expensive those surveys are, and also accounting for weather days, which I didn't clearly appreciate until my last offshore trip to the Morro Bay area. And we had upward, we averaged, I don't know, 40–50% weather days. So it is something to kind of think about early and try to understand both the similarities and the differences.
And that's a great segue to my next question, which I wanted to turn to Craig. Can you tell us a little bit more about the similarities and differences between East Coast and West Coast marine environments? And are there any specific technologies that might be considered for mitigating potential effects that have been identified in the permitting process on the West Coast in particular?
Yes, thanks, Raya. There are some differences we can point to here on the West Coast. I'll use marine mammals as an example. We have a greater diversity of marine mammal species within and adjacent to these California call areas, or as we look ahead towards wind energy areas, compared to shallower waters of the East Coast. This includes some deeper water species of whales, several species of beaked whales, as well as California sea lions. We've got other pinniped or seal species not found on the East Coast. So again, a bit more diversity. Fortunately, the continued development of numerous technologies will improve our capacity for monitoring and mitigation of these species, say during the seafloor surveys that Lisa was just talking about, as well as during construction, and then when we move ahead and look at long-term monitoring strategies. A couple of noteworthy technologies to keep your eye on, some things we've been working with quite a bit on the East Coast. The first one I would mention would be infrared, sometimes known as IR. These are systems that detect thermal energy, and I'm talking about marine mammals, so they often have a heat signature when viewed through these infrared systems. These systems work in both daylight and darkness, so extremely valuable for conducting 24-hour operations while also monitoring and mitigating safely. Some of these newer systems are demonstrating the potential to detect a whale blow, for example, out to 10 kilometers using an automated detection algorithm. So the camera will literally tell you, hey, I think there's a whale blow at 7 kilometers. So just improving situational awareness and then mitigating any potential effects of the activities that might be ongoing. Similarly, I would mention acoustic monitoring. There have been some challenges with acoustic monitoring on the East Coast simply because of the species present are not as readily detected through their vocalizations during construction, or I should say these marine survey activities. Acoustic monitoring, I think, will be more feasible on the West Coast. So this is actually using hydrophones to listen for vocalizing animals. Some of these deeper water whales I mentioned, the beaked whales in particular, they vocalize at higher frequencies or higher pitches than some of the species found on the East Coast. And that makes them more readily detectable by these underwater hydrophones compared to some of the efforts on the East Coast. So the speed at which these technologies are developing is impressive. It's difficult to keep up with. One more point I'll mention about these technologies is there's a lot of potential to deploy them remotely. So a platform offshore, whether it's a buoy or some other kind of fixed station, you can have these infrared or acoustic monitoring sensors that then transmit data to people back on shore. So this reduces personnel and assets needed to be offshore. It feeds into real-time adaptive management strategies for mitigation. So almost think of it like a command center where you have at all times an awareness of the marine species that might be present and how that relates to mitigation you might be considering for the activities at hand. So yes, thanks to these differences on the West Coast, it gives us a few more options. And then with the continued development of these technologies, it really is an impressive array of monitoring and mitigation strategies we can look at on the West Coast. Thanks, Raya.
Thank you, Craig. So we've discussed the complexity of some of the challenges associated with the environmental permitting and the survey process for these next steps in the offshore wind development and permitting process in California. California is obviously the very initial stages of defining where and how offshore wind projects will take place off its coast. And I want to talk a little bit about whether there are any efficiencies that can be gained in these early stages of the process, either by government agencies or by project proponents that can then facilitate project level reviews. And Jennifer, I want to start with you. Are there steps that the state government can take now at the leasing phase that would facilitate project review under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, at the state level down the line?
Yeah, they not only can those steps be taken, those steps are already being taken. And in fact, I'll just mention that our state agency coordinating body was actually established way back 10 years ago in 2011. At that time, offshore wind and other offshore renewable energy technologies like marine hydrokinetic and tidal energy, that was really starting to, we kind of saw the writing on the wall. We didn't know who was going to kind of leap out ahead of the others at that time, but we did form a body called the Marine Renewable Energy Working Group. And we were sort of under the umbrella of the California Natural Resources Agency departments, entities, and commissions. So we've actually been coordinating for over 10 years, looking at ways to make sure that we are not getting in each other's way, that we are not communicating different things to project proponents, potential applicants, regulated communities. So, it's kind of, do we have this same message? Are we all rowing in the same direction? Do we all have the same expectations? And how do we deal with the reality that each of us has our own jurisdiction and our own responsibilities? And sometimes those are complementary, and occasionally those are in conflict. And that's okay, as long as we know that that is just something that we want to make sure we have a conversation about and see if there is common ground. And in other places that, that project proponents may need to just understand that satisfying one entity, that satisfies their own jurisdiction and permitting, but it doesn't necessarily meet everyone's. But that's where having that sort of organized group, and I would say we've really redoubled our efforts since 2016 when the BOEM California Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force was created. That really unlocked a lot of energy and sort of, frankly, resources, particularly from BOEM side, and to have us convene even with even more focus. And just tips that I would say for the regulated community, don't try to get cute and kind of divide and conquer and like pit us against each other. Give us all the same information. Let us all know at the same time. It can be a bit of a web, but you really don't have to go sequentially. And so part of it is the responsibility of the regulated community. But I will say that, part of the responsibility is on us as those state agencies to continue our coordination and keep each other in the loop if we hear something. And I think we've been really successful at that so far.
That's great. And Whitney, I'd love to get your perspective on this as well, because you've had experience with this process in several different jurisdictions now. Are there certain opportunities to coordinate and address the various state permitting requirements at this early stage to facilitate future development phases and ultimately project reviews?
I think so. And I think building from what Jennifer said, not divide and conquer, not sequential, even at the seafloor survey stage, for example, right? Making sure that your surveys are going to meet not only BOEM's guidelines, which is a lot of the focus, of course, right? But also any state regulatory agencies that will have jurisdiction over that. So you want to make sure from the outset that the work that you're doing, the underlying technical work, the studies you prepare, the reports that will be appended to your construction and operation plan, if you will, that those are going to meet the state regulatory requirements as well as the federal regulatory requirements. So, for example, if we're looking at fisheries, NOAA fisheries, obviously, you need to answer the mail for NOAA fisheries when it comes to commercial and recreational fisheries plus finfish. But CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, also has jurisdiction over that, as does the Coastal Commission with respect to the resources that use the state waters that also go out into federal waters. They will have some say over that. So you would want to make sure whatever analysis you were conducting for commercial recreational fisheries, and then also just finfish, EFH under NIMS, you want to make sure that that work you do is acceptable to all of those agencies. So you're not having to go back and redo work and resubmit.
That's great. So we have 10 minutes remaining in the in our webinar, and I wanted to take some of the questions that we've received from our audience, and feel free to, any of the panelists can jump in to answer them. So here's one. The announcement of yesterday focuses on the development of wind farms in federal waters. Are or can wind farms in state waters be considered?
Well, I guess that's me. Yes, and we also are, the State Lands Commission is currently reviewing 2 applications for small scale wind facilities, about from 2.5 to 3 to the 3 mile limit. So it's just inside that federal state boundary. And we've been working on those applications. First, a lot of back and forth with the applicants just to get complete information to be able to move forward into our outreach phase. And we actually set up a web page on the State Lands Commission website. And since I can't sort of talk and type at the same time, I'll just say I'll give that answer and then I'll drop that link to our web page into the chat. It's full of information. You can sign up for the mailing list for updates on those projects. You know, we have not solicited, so it's a little bit different than the BOEM process. You know, we don't have a lease sale. We don't go out and market state waters for like, hey, come and apply here. We receive these applications and we are legally duty bound to process those applications. And now you're kind of going back into that loop that I mentioned earlier, which is about sort of bringing the best information and recommendation forward to our commissioners that we can, so that they can make that determination of whether it's in the best interest of the state to proceed. So because time is short, I'll leave it at that for now, but you'll find a lot more information on the webpage that we have stood at for this. And I will drop that in the chat momentarily.
That's great. Thank you, Jennifer. Lisa, I think this next question is to you. How many months or years before offshore lease bidding occurs? Can you talk a little bit about the next steps in the process and approximate timing of when we might expect a lease sale? And then the questioner asks, eventually seeing floating steel in the water, which I think gets to that second phase in the process you described.
Yeah, thank you, Rhea. So we just, got the announcement yesterday, so our timelines aren't set yet. We are working on it, and a lot of that is going to be determined from our task force meeting that's on June 24th, which is open to the public. So please stay tuned for that one. But just making some assumptions, we know that there's a New York Bight effort that was announced and released earlier, and that lease sale is scheduled approximately for mid next year. So this like spring, like a year from now. And so my thought would be that if we did move forward with lease sales, they would be in that time frame. And then your second question was when does we get to the end of the BOEM process, which is approval of an actual steel in the water. And I think you can just take from the East Coast what their timeline was, which was multiple years, but that each one kind of gets a little more efficient. So this is just me saying that the first project out the door would likely take a little more time than subsequent projects, but it wouldn't be for it's not till multiple years from now.
Well, thank you. Another question is regarding the coordination between state and federal processes. Is planning for a joint NEPA-CEQA process and document preparation underway? Is that something that's been discussed or a possibility?
Yeah, Well, I'll start and then Jen can fix if I mess up. But I was thinking, again, we don't have a lot of plans and right now because of the recentness of the announcement, but also that we really do rely on the task force meeting to guide us and help us with our decision making. And so that is going to be a topic. Having said that, we have been working really closely with all the states and the governor's office over the last couple of years. And while, we don't have a set plan right now, it is going to be in coordination and close, understanding with what the state processes is.
Yeah, that was a great explanation. I don't have anything to add on top of that.
Great. These are great questions. Maybe we'll take one more before we conclude. There's a question about adding additional areas in other counties or areas with good resource potential that are outside of the two discussed yesterday. Lisa or anyone else, can you describe the process for adding future areas to the leasing process in BOEM?
Well, you said BOEM, so I'll try. And I just want to say, I think we're wrapping up. I really appreciate this time to get to talk, and it really has been an exciting hour, and also it's an exciting time. So not only are you guys not happy with the recent announcements, but you want more wind. And I think for that would be, it does start from the beginning. So that would be when BOEM would issue a call for information and nominations. Interest in nominations, excuse me. And so that would be, we would go out with an announcement, we would look for interest in a different area and start that process from the beginning. That's how it works. So thank you.
Great. Well, Lisa, you said it well, a really exciting time for this industry, for all of us involved in offshore wind development, and especially those of us who have wanted to see those floating turbines off the California coast. Thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time for this very, very helpful discussion. And thanks to the participants for joining us. This concludes the webinar, and we're grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.